cette masterclass tenue par le Maître du Réel de cette année, Peter Greenaway, auquel je donne ma bienvenue. L'événement consacré à Peter Greenaway a été organisé en collaboration avec l'ECAL de Lausanne et la Cinémathèque suisse. Je suis là avec Émilie Bugès qui a suivi pour Vision du Réel tout le processus de l'organisation de cet événement et je lui laisse très volontiers la parole.
Hello everyone, I'm switching to English so our guests can understand me as well. Welcome, we're very happy to see you in such a great numbers and we are very happy and honored to be able to offer you a masterclass by Peter Greenaway today. Just a few words about him and his practice before he starts. As a short introduction, it's interesting to know in regard to Peter Greenaway's career that he's been educated as a painter, and it's something that is of course very much meaningful in all his films, be it in the way he uses colors, be it in the fact that artists are very often put as subjects, be it in a way that the films adopt paintings within images or adopt the shape of tableau vivant. Peter Greenaway started his career working for the Central Office of Information, which was a structure in the UK that used to produce documentaries that were supposed to be broadcasted abroad in former countries of the British Empire. It's very interesting to know this because it means he started his career first as an editor and then as a filmmaker in this framework, making documentaries, but reached at a certain point the conclusion that documentary was falsified as much as any fiction might be. So he decided from that moment, of course, if you know his work, you know that it took different shapes and it evolved around along the way, a long time. But basically, he decided that he would tell the truth and talk about the real true lies instead of trying to kind of pretend any kind of objectivity or truth. The recurring aspects of his work is numbers, classification, but also the use of colors, insects, dead animals, still lives, sex, violence, and art. We are very happy and honored to welcome with us Peter Greenaway today.
Well, yes indeed, it is good to see a full house. And in the morning. I normally go to the cinema in the evening. It's very important to come out of a cinema and approach darkness. When you finally leave here at lunchtime, it'll still be light outside. Strange disorientation. Okay, well that introduction, of course, I would readily agree with, and I think probably it's necessary for me to expand on that, and I suppose provide the data, if you like, for indeed the circumstances and characteristics of that introduction. Let me tell you what I'd like to do. They have given me probably, I think, 2 hours to talk to you. I will judge by your restlessness and who leaves the room and for what reasons, and determine whether you're getting thoroughly bored, so that we will negotiate maybe the length of how long I'm going to stand here. And then supposedly we have at the end maybe between 30 minutes, 40 minutes, in which we can open up a dialogue. And I'm sure that you would agree, often a dialogue is far more entertaining indeed than a monologue. So I think we will conduct it, and I will talk, and first of all maybe spend 5 minutes making general introductions to my, I suppose, likes and dislikes, My provocations, number one provocation is cinema is dying very rapidly, and none of you will inhabit this space probably in 20 years' time, so make the best of it now. And I think then after that, I will show a clip. We will talk about it specifically and fit it in, I suppose, to a general program about notions, not only of my subjectivity, but cinema in general. And then we will, as it were, go through. I have something on this laptop, something like 60 hours of material, and there's absolutely no way, of course, that we have time or indeed interest in seeing all that material. Some of the items are very, very short. I suppose some of the items are probably only 2 or 3 minutes long, and some are much longer. So I will just give you, as it were, an introductory taste. Some of the works I favor personally a little more than others, so you must accept my indulgence to give you perhaps more than you need. We will see. All right. We are, of course, I am obviously speaking to you in English, but we have indeed a whole range of translators up behind you. So I hope that everything I say can be fully understood. Okay, there is a way that this title, may be a bit provocative in its own way, is really, I suppose, about visual literacy. I would think that maybe cinema is an extraordinary opportunity to get people to open their eyes. I've just made a film about Eisenstein, who spent a long time in America in 1929, 1931, and he agreed with Chaplin, who was of the same opinion, that perhaps the worst thing that ever happened to cinema was the introduction of sound. Let me make an explanation of what I would possibly indeed agree with in a strange, maybe perverse way with both Eisenstein and Chaplin. There has always, of course, been text in association with so-called silent cinema, though I don't think any of us really realizes and understands that. Was there ever something called silent cinema? I very much doubt it. From the very, very beginning, people always wanted to make an association primarily, in the first place, of course, with sound effects and certainly music. But then in 1929, when everybody got very excited about adding the notion of, indeed, I suppose, what could be described as fully sophisticated soundtrack, a strange occurrence happened. At least when you are watching silent cinema, there is and has to be, for comprehensibility, a real concern indeed about picture making. I rather suspect, and of course I'm not at all alone in believing in this, that probably the greatest period of cinema was probably from about 1922, when people began to really understand perhaps what cinema finally really was, until the advent of sound, let's call that 1929. An absolute conviction that you had to understand, comprehend, appreciate, be excited, in a sense, by the pictures. And then with the introduction of sound cinema, there was a shift. People began to rely very much upon, should we say, the textual, the dialogue, or the notions indeed of text, to shift a concentration away from the picture to a comprehension which, of course, all over the Western world, ever since the invention of notions of text, is the prime way in which we organize our communication. And there is a way that I suppose the secondary title to visual literacy is my first provocation. And that is that I believe that most people are visually illiterate. Let me ask you, who in the audience, please put your hands up, have been, well, let me ask you first the provocation. Do you really believe that you are visually literate? Now, you're all incredibly good across all the language barriers at being able to communicate in text. There's no surprise. From your mothers, primarily, you begin to learn how to speak, how to communicate in text. Throughout childhood, through all the education systems of the world, we become more and more sophisticated at putting meaning to notions of text, either heard or read. And through the rest of our adult life, we never finish polishing our ability to make that communication work. This happens, of course, I don't know how many languages are left in the world. There used to be something like 25,000. I think it's down to about 800 now, isn't it? even all the minor languages. I come from South Wales, so I could really speak to you in Welsh, but I suspect nobody in the audience would understand me. The downside and the upside, indeed, of the notion of the proliferation of the Tower of Babel situation of languages. But when you think about it, you spend all your lives, let's say from the tender age of 12 months, 14 months, learning how to communicate through text. So we basically have a text communication world. I would argue that although cinema is supposed to be about pictures, cinema is really a text-based situation. I suspect that nobody in this room has ever seen a film that did not start life with a text. I used to say a text written on the back of a cigarette packet, but nobody's supposed to smoke anymore, so I can't say that. So I could say perhaps on the back of an envelope. So however primitive that text is, that's how it begins. Let me, I suppose, elaborate on that. I'm trained as a painter. I paint, I draw, but it's absolutely a waste of my time to go to a film studio or a producer with 4 paintings, 3 lithographs, and a book of drawings and say, give me the money. Most people, again, and certainly maybe producers, and I know there are 1 or 2 producers in this audience, so my provocation is a little barbed. A producer or a studio or anybody who's about to finance and organize a film will need a text. Godard, famously, living not very far away from where we are here, said, okay, cinema started off on the wrong foot. It is umbilically associated with the bookshop. Supreme example of that, of course, in the last 15 years, the biggest thing probably in world cinema is goddamn Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. And we know these are texts. You can go down to the local bookshop. Do you still have a bookshop here in Lyon? Most bookshops in the world, of course, are disappearing. And you can find that text. So that also suggests that a producer is going to be much more interested in a text which has already proven itself in the marketplace. So, you know, the Old Testament says, in the beginning was the Word. Wrong. In the beginning was the image. God got Adam to name everything. And Adam could hardly name anything, give it a textual significance, unless it first of all existed, unless of course, it was primarily an image. So no longer believe in that ridiculous statement that in the beginning was the Word. Wrong. I just had an exhibition of the Venice Biennale this year that indeed tried to pretend that indeed that the situation that the exemplar indeed should be was an exhibit called In the Beginning Was the Image. So what I'm trying to tell you may be overloading you now with continual repetition, but the sophistication we all have about communicating through text indeed is excessive. But you do not spend as much time, as much effort, as much imagination considering the image as you have done in your lives. And there's nobody here probably over 80. Anybody here over 80? I was 74 last week, so I'm not very far away from 80. And there's nobody here under 18. Is that right? Anybody here under 18? So that large stretch of time, which let's be convenient with numbers, let's say it's 60 years. So you have every single excuse to be indeed a very sophisticated in handling text. But you know how it works. When you're about 9, 10, 11, right about that age, the distance between primary school and secondary school, your teachers say, put away the crayons, put away the easel, you've got to get serious now, you've got to pay the supermarket bill, and you've got to be able to afford a mortgage. And most people believe you will never do that by making images, but you will certainly likely to do it by learning and manipulating and organizing your life through text. And we all live, I don't know what the age limit is now for men in Switzerland, but where I'm living now, which is Holland, it's probably about 84 for men and probably about 87 for women. Does that more or less fit Switzerland? Or are you more deeply disadvantaged than me? But that means if you give up looking and examining and organizing text at 9, 10, 11, 12, you live to 80, that suggests 70 barren years where you basically have no real connection with the notion of either appreciating and certainly not manufacturing the notion of image. Isn't that tragic? I mean, it's tragic, first of all, on a basic level of appreciation of the richness and potentiality of a world of images. But also, I think it desperately disenfranchises you, in a sense, with so many things. My big complaint about cinema, indeed, is it is too much text takes place. I was in London last week. We were distributing the new film about Eisenstein. And in a certain sort of context, I said that all scriptwriters should be shot. This went viral, of course, out of context, and I was accused of all sorts of miscreants and all sorts of calumny. I do think, it has to be put in context. Of course, I'm fascinated by text, but text in its rightful place. And just think how text has been prioritized. We've had 8,000 years in the Western world of lyrical poetry, from Homer onwards. I think since before Jane Austen, we've had at least 350 years of a novel, which hands its meaning down in literacy and text. And of course, we've had the theatre. The theatre always hands down its meaning and its communication as text, text, text. Doesn't it make a lot of sense that we should really develop a sophisticated medium, which we now subsequently call cinema, which is wholly about communication of the world, ourselves, and God made, essentially through image? Okay, you're going to say we have painting, and we have its sister associations, I suppose, like indeed draftsmanship and printing, etc. But when you think about it, most of painting, right up to the Impressionists, has again, just like cinema now, been essentially text-based. There's an enormous struggle for all sorts of painters, certainly since the Renaissance, to be recognized as independent practitioners of communication. You see it happening over and over again. But I think there's one key point. It's a painting of Westminster Abbey by Monet in 1861, which finally could be said not to be about text. Most, I suppose, large-scale history painting, and I'm sure you will understand what that means, is essentially about illustration. And it's predominantly two subject matters. One is the antique world, Roman and Greek history, and I suppose the other one is certainly the Bible. Most painting before 1861 was an illustration either of ancient texts or indeed the Bible. But even if you think about things like still life and portraits, there is a way. I live in Amsterdam. I'm thinking about Dutch still lives. Okay, you might paint a lemon, again with great virtuosity, like many Dutch painters indeed did. But what you are really talking is a moralistic position. You paint a lemon because, to you, with your literary education, you know that it's an emblem of the sourness of life. And when you paint a portrait, the chances are it'll be an allegory. So again, it's back again to some sort of notion again, which is essentially associated with indeed text and literature. I think there was a way, of course, that every now and again the anticipation of Monet's painting of Westminster Abbey was always on its way to intimations throughout the whole of the 19th century. But finally, fully fledged, I think, the notion of painting being painting, and not just an archival service, so-called representing notions of the seen world, was quite late coming. And I suppose these were the beginnings. After Monet, etc., comes the post-impressionists, and ultimately people like Picasso, and then the first abstract notions of non-figuration, away from the idea of simply illustrating text, with people, I suppose, like Kandinsky and Mondrian, who could be regarded as the first, should we say, totally non-figurative, non-textual examination. And I think that these painters and these circumstances initiated the greatest century of painting which we've ever had, which is the 20th century. Painting was finally allowed just to be painting, and not an archival service. I hope now that we ought to be able to do the same with cinema. But I'm pretty certain you would all admit that a large part of the reason you come to a cinema is to be told a story, right? That's why you believe somehow or other there's a notion of the cinema relating not only creativity, but also to your daily life. I would argue with you, but not here because it would take too long, that there's no such thing as a story. A story does not exist. Let me make an easier road into that. It's self-evident that you're in a cinema and you're looking at a series of frames. Godard again, who lives very close to us, perhaps he can even hear us, suggested cinema is the truth, 24 frames a second. He was playing with us like he always does, and that's very fair and very real. But there is no such thing as a frame in nature. A frame in nature simply does not exist. It's a confrontation and a particular artificial situation, which of course exists, I suppose, in newspapers and certainly in ideas of painting, but also dominates the notion of projection, whether that's television or whether indeed it is cinema. I, like you, have a gyroscopic head. It constantly moves. I remember seeing film from Czechoslovakia, of all places, of looking at a driver's eyes when they're driving a car, and to be absolutely astonished, of course, makes sense. Eyes never stop still. The only time your eyes are ever still is when you are dead. So the idea of a frame becomes even more absurd, doesn't it? We can construct and we can replicate the notion of a frame, but there is a way it's totally artificial because there is no such thing. There's no such thing for you. You never, ever see the world in a single static frame. Impossible. But we have, as it were, allied ourselves with this, I suppose, comfort zone position and have created a phenomenology which we sometimes indeed call cinema. It's desperately related to that. So in a sense, there are then, shall we say, two big falsities about the notion of the cinema. First of all, the idea of the frame, which is totally artificial, and then I would argue, along similar grounds, the notion of the story. Please don't tell me that everybody's life is a story. That is absolutely untrue. This is just a notion of comfort zone, creativity in order to make communication as we imagine it easier. So I would argue again that there's no such thing as a frame, and there's no such thing as a story, but we built the cinema on these two artificial situations. I don't know what we're going to do about it. Maybe we're waiting for a Monet to come along and tell us how stupid it is and do something about it. Relative to that, I think, let me give you a date. Let me give you the date of the 31st of September 1983, which generally now is supposedly the time of the very beginning of the visual digital revolution. It is the time, they say, about the invention and indeed the public use of the zapper or the remote control. Let me rework this sentence. I believe cinema died on the 31st of September 1983 when the zapper or the remote control was introduced into the living rooms of the world. Finish of cinema. Up until that time, basically cinema is an entirely passive occupation. Look at you now. You're about to enjoy some cinema associated with that passive invitation. First of all, you're going to sit in the dark. What the hell are you doing sitting in the dark? You are not nocturnal animals. Second, you're going to be obliged probably to sit still because you don't want to indicate irritation amongst your neighbors. But that's another interesting thing because the notion of watching projection now en masse is becoming very, very rare. All of you have probably got a smartphone, you've probably got a laptop, and most of you watch projection, cinematic experience, either on your own or in association with one or two people, either in your front room or in your office. So that's another indication, surely, that the cinema of our fathers and forefathers was going very, very rapidly. Where can you actually, I suppose, figure yourself like you are now? You're at a film festival. Maybe film festivals are the last places where we really can understand cinema as our grandfathers understood it, watching en masse all together at one and the same time in a sort of gregarious notion. So cinema, you could say, is becoming less and less and less gregarious. And I rather suspect the way things are going, I'm not rich enough yet to have a computer on my wrist, but surely very soon I shall be obliged, like all of you, to do the self-same thing. So you can see how we're imploding the cinematic experience. This surely indicates to me that cinema is dying, if not already dead. I read an article in Variety magazine. Many of you know that Variety is the Hollywood Californian vehicle for the expression of, should we say, American Hollywood cinema. And it suggested that only 5% of the world's population actually watch cinema in cinemas. Now everybody's watching, should we say, cinematic experience, but we're watching it on smartphones and television and DVDs. I mean, 95% of people are now watching cinema in a way that Lumiere and Méliès never ever conceived of it. Isn't that another indication? And this is coming from Hollywood in Variety magazine, an acceptance again that cinema as we know it heretofore is certainly changing and certainly rapidly diminishing. I'm absolutely convinced that my great-grandchildren will probably talk to their parents and say, cinema? What was that? Anybody here in this room still look at silent cinema? Are you an academic, sir? Are you interested in what trolley buses look like in Chicago in 1921? Is that the reason you would watch silent cinema? Anybody have children here? And surely probably at Christmas time you watch Buster Keaton and maybe Charlie Chaplin. Again. But who basically really watches silent cinema? And there were 31 years of it. A lot of films were made. But you could see basically, apart from one or two nostalgics, one or two academics, one or two small children, of course there aren't any small children in the room, apart from these people, which is really a minority of a minority of a minority, nobody looks at silent cinema. And surely doesn't that indicate that's the way that the rest of cinema is going to go? Dispute? Anybody going to shriek in anger at such a provocation? Isn't it extraordinary? Just think of the huge amount of evidence to make those millions and tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of films between 1895 and 1929. And nobody pays them any attention, or any worthwhile attention. So please don't disagree with me unless you can come up with a much better argument that cinema is not dying. I come and see you afterwards. Under all these circumstances, then, it's no good continually being negative, though I don't believe I am negative. I'm just telling aspects of the same truths that you know. We have to, in some senses, imagine what's going to happen in the future. I am in an extraordinarily privileged position to be, I suppose, a practicing feature-making filmmaker. We're just about to make a film about the Romanian sculptor Brancusi, and it'll be our 16th film. We sort of managed to get together enough sufficient money to make a film probably every 18 months, and I've been doing that now certainly for 35 years. But there is a way that I know that the cinema I make is really somehow belongs in a museum. There are very few filmmakers who make cinema like me. And I will be aggressively proud and arrogant to suggest that what I try to make is rather like what Monet was trying to do in 1861, to essentially, as he was making painting, I'm trying very hard to make cinema. Cinema now, especially the digital revolution, is an extraordinary, powerful medium with an amazing vocabulary. And Microsoft gives us a new gizmo, a new tool, a new way of making a film practically every afternoon, and it's getting richer and richer and richer. But proportionately, though, the actual cinema imagination around the world, I'm saying dangerous things here now, of course, and they are meant to be provocative, in a curious way becomes less and less sophisticated. All those apologists, should we say in the 1910s and 1920s, people like Bazin, for example, really imagined cinema could be the great 20th, 21st century seventh art, but I certainly don't believe it is allowed to enjoy those characteristics. Bazin suggested indeed that the cinema could be easily deconstructed, that's not a word he would have used, let's say broken down into three motives, one of which of course is the theatre, Most cinema, in a way, is recorded theatre, operates exactly in the same use of actors and mise en scène. And of course, most theatre, in a sense, is associated with literature. So most cinema, as we've already suggested, is very, very literary in its structure. And if you're very, very lucky, maybe some picture making. I think that's a tragedy. I think cinema has been very, very disappointing. I think there are very, very few, should we say, visionary filmmakers. I think you can probably count them on the fingers of two hands. People who really understood that cinema was something separate, something different, something with its own vocabulary, which had the potential of being very, very good, and I think we have basically wasted the medium, if you like. Okay, these are provocations. There must be film students in the audience who all want to be film directors. Don't bother. Go and find something better to do. There is a way, don't you agree, that there's something about the human psyche that demands enervating audiovisual experience. The ancient Greeks had it with extraordinary technological amphitheaters, where it said you drop a coin in the middle of one of these extraordinary Athenian, for example, theaters, 5,000 people could hear it in the back of the stalls. An extraordinary contemporary technology related to give you, the audience, a grand audio-visual satisfaction. And then the Romans took over, people like Pompey building the biggest theaters that have ever been seen in the whole of the Western world. And then I suppose with the advent of Christianity, Christianity in churches began to take over that demand for audio-visual excitement. And that would continue probably until Monteverdi, when opera houses began and picked up that desire of the human psyche for audio-visual excitement. And that continued certainly till the end of the First World War, 1918. And they reckon that really cinema was taken really seriously for the first time round about the ending of the First World War. And at that time, of course, the death of opera in 1918 was really, I suppose, the wholesale birth of the notion of public cinema. And that's where we are now, and we've had 120 years of it. And I think in a curious way, that's a long, long time for a technology like cinema. And you know the medium is the message, so the way that cinema is supposed to be developed is intimately associated with the technology that makes it. And now, of course, we've leaped ahead into the digital revolution, basically, or except perhaps one man, Tarantino, who stupidly still plays with celluloid. There is a way that we're becoming much more, I suppose, associated with what the new technology actually means. But there are very, very, very few films who actually really use the vocabulary of the digital revolution. Most people who pay lip service, I suppose, to the digital revolution, simply use it to reproduce what celluloid cinema has been doing ever since 1895, which of course is not good enough, but it's no good for us to complain about this because mankind is always very, very cautionary and moves very, very slowly. The Americans have a Capitol, which is basically a Greek temple architecture that was made 2,500 years ago. So there are certain things that we will persist in repeating and repeating and repeating with little variations, but not really profoundly changing the basic concept of the medium. So you see, I am full of complaints. I am full of disenchantments. I really do imagine that cinema could be really extraordinary, but I don't think it is. I think it's ended up as bedtime stories for adults, all of which appeared in the bookshop to begin with. I think cinema desperately has to separate itself from what I would call four tyrannies. First two tyrannies, I think I've already suggested. The cinema should really become imagistic and not be an adjunct to the bookshop. It should cut that umbilical cord that exists between places like this and indeed bookshop down the road. And I think the second, we must really seriously examine what we mean by the frame. There's every indication, of course, that's happening. American abstract and expressionist painting made painting so large, the edges of the frame were beyond the periphery of your vision. I suppose IMAX, Omnimax theaters have been trying to do that, but isn't it strange that IMAX and Omnimax, although it's been around for about 30 years, has never really taken off? There was a pledge by the Americans to put an IMAX theater in every city in the world which had over 500,000 inhabitants. That has hardly happened. How many IMAX theatres are there in Switzerland? Is there one in Zurich? Is there one in Geneva? I don't think so. That was extraordinary technology, which promised so much, but delivered so little. There are, of course, all sorts of experiments. You know, certainly Walt Disney, who has so much money, to make sense around completely 360-degree cinema. But just think how much we have to change our attitudes really to make that universal. I always have some doubts about that too. I've been experimenting as a VJ with multiple screens in a 360-degree sort of circumference. But it is strange that basically most of us confine our vision to 270 degrees. Otherwise, we physically have to use our bodies. But that's obviously becoming part of it. There's again part of this strange attitude of what you're doing, sitting in the dark, and you have no right because you are diurnal animals, you are not nocturnal owls. Secondly, you are persuaded to look in one direction. Goddard, again, filmmaker, who's just down the road, suggested that indeed, if you sit like you're sitting now, that at least most of the world is behind your head. And doesn't that incredibly downgrade your physiognomy? Doesn't that really downgrade your potentiality as a moving animal on the surface of the earth? And you also, presumably, suppose for 120 minutes, which is recognized now as the length of a feature film, you're supposed to sit still. I bet you in your beds last night, even though you were asleep, your body again had a sense of its own momentum and physiological movement that wouldn't even equate with that. So sitting in the dark, looking in one direction, being still, that's hardly a human characteristic. But you're going to be able to tell me, and I can tell you back, that all these sort of things are being adjusted and considered. But it also suggests a breakdown of what we might once upon a time have considered to be notions of cinema. All right. I hope to entertain you a little bit more now by actually showing you what I'm talking about. Some of you might know indeed, or might see some of my cinema, which is out there and associated, I suppose, with what used to be called European art cinema. There's hardly much left of it now. Just think about France, country very close to you, from which you owe so much, to all French speakers. There's an extraordinary movement called the Nouvelle Vague, which created amazing picture making for probably about 23 years. And then running almost parallel was an extraordinary period of Italian cinema, La Dolce Vita, the last emperor, creating again extraordinary pictures, all gone, all disappeared. I suppose they tell me that in Paris over 1 million people are occupied in a French film industry, and that means not only filmmakers and cinema managers, but their families and their children who have expensive educations based upon the, should we say, the income of a film editor. That's an awful lot of people, a film industry that supports 1 million people. But is it not sad, and I'm standing up, I suppose, to provocations in return, that really it's not making very good films anymore? Has a satisfactory film industry, but are making very poor and mediocre film making, certainly as compared to the last, 35 years. I don't know, what do you want? Do you want a successful film industry, or do you want to make good films? Because they don't seem necessarily to be the same thing. Maybe that's got to do with all sorts of notions of, I suppose, capitalist enterprise. I understand the French cinema is very heavily subsidized, so whether you make a good film, a mediocre film, or a very bad film, it hardly matters. The film editor will still be paid. So that's no incitement to produce something extraordinary. Maybe that's a temporary situation, and perhaps it could change, but I doubt it, because I just told you cinema's dead already, so why do we need to pursue that? So, but anyway, in association with the privileges that I have to be a filmmaker and to use modern technologies, etc., there is a way that I have a sort of secondary film life, which is related not to normal film finance sources, not to the notion of producer-director in the same way, but is created by, I suppose, contemporary cultural education, which is in the hands of museums and art galleries, and institutions, should we say, which are more concerned with notions of quote-unquote education. Now, I know some people would regard that as rather deleterious, rather avuncular. As soon as people realize they are being educated, they sort of turn off a bit, don't they? You know, this is not the position of cinema. I don't go to cinema to be educated. But of course that's rubbish. But ever since, the concept of describing what art was, I think all of us agreed, starting with Horace in about 1870, that any work of culture has to do two things. It has to educate, and it certainly has to entertain. If it merely educates, then everybody gets basically bored, and if it really entertains, then everybody forgets it. So there has to be a way in which you can find a balance between these two things. And of course, all successful works of art, from Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel to Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin, does manage to find that average mean that's associated with a combination indeed of entertainment and instruction. So I have been fortunate again in the last 4 or 5 years to receive commissions and encouragement to make all sorts of products which are maybe outside the mainstream even of European art cinema, and the places you will see them will probably be indeed in museums and art galleries. Let me show you again how this is an extraordinary opportunity to increase visual literacy, to break away from the tropes and paradigms that are associated indeed with boring old cinema, and to find ways and means to take parts of the vocabulary and expand them. Not so long ago, I was invited to have an exhibition in a design center in Milan. What the commission was really to celebrate Italian design, deservedly so, but it was related more or less to Ferrari and Olivetti. I suggested we should do something much bigger, and to make, as it were, an overview, very briefly, very much within your own knowledge, which would start, shall we say, AD 70, when Pompeii was destroyed, and go all the way to Mussolini. I wanted to come all the way to the modern day, but I was told if you start using contemporary Italian designers, they're such a competitive lot, we're going to have a lot of problems, because if you leave somebody out, there's going to be cries of pain. So can you please go up at least to our grandfathers, so we take it to Mussolini. Now this for me was an extraordinary opportunity, because obviously a design museum has quite a bit of money, and we can experiment. Now here's an idea which is related, I'm sure, to the back end, probably, of your ideas of cinema, certainly to the front end of my cinema. We're in a cinema. I also believe that cinemas are very, very stupid, and they have held cinema back. We should have got rid of these places a long, long time ago. You're not on raked seats, are you? You're all flat, which is a little unusual, but most cinemas have raked seats, and most cinemas have indeed 2 aisles, which means there's no aisle down the middle. That's not absolutely true, of course, but there's only one good seat in any cinema, and that gentleman who's chewing his thumb there is the only man who has a good seat in this cinema. All the rest of you might as well go home. This is not true about theatres, because theatres are 2-dimensional space, however shallow the stage, and it's certainly not true about opera houses, which are really basically based on a U-shot. And again, often opera house stages are very deep, so you're looking at a 3-dimensional experience. So if you, madam, over there, if you were in an opera house or a theatre, and you, madam, over there, would legitimately have good seats, because it's a 3-dimensional experience. But cinema's a 2-dimensional experience. So the only good seat, this man's taken his thumb out of his mouth now, the man in the middle here is actually in the position where the pictures were taken from. So you are in the same seat as the cameraman. So you're absolutely in the ideal position. You might remember that Renaissance theatres had a concept called the king's seat. If you know something about Renaissance theatres, they're very much virtuoso games of perspective. So there's only one real place that you could see a design perspective, and you, sir, are in that privileged position. So I'm wondering all the time, what is this relationship we have with the screen? And why is it always rectangular? It doesn't have to be. And why is it, in a sense, related to cinemas like this? So what I wanted to do was to see, in fact, if a screen could influence the film that was shown on it. I think you would agree that's almost an impossibility. I think, some theatres, and certainly opera houses, are related deliberately to works of art, works of performance that are made for that space. But such is the ubiquity of cinema. Cinema is supposed to be able to be projected in any cinema in the world. So there really is no relationship, is there, between the flatness of a two-dimensional rectangular parallelogram and the way it's projected. So let's change that. First of all, then, I'm going to have multiple screens, because the idea of a single screen, remember what I said about gyroscopic heads and moving eyes, seems to be ridiculous. So my first screen is, and you must regard this, of course, as a diagram, and therefore it's essentially two-dimensional, is a quarter of the Earth's surface. And here we have, indeed, imagine that as being a three-dimensional object, as a two-dimensional object, and it would suggest that's the place where we put all the big ideas, the earthly, the global ideas. That begins as an idea, and you will see in a minute how we develop it. Incidentally, this red figure, the film was made, the project was made in Milan, so he's a red Italian communist male, 5 foot 11 inches tall. To give you an idea, we're talking big screens here. All right, I need many screens, so I've given you my wide shot screen. Now, the Italians invented the Triumphal Arch. There must be Italians in the audience. And there's a relationship, isn't there, by ideas of pomposity and triumphalism and exhibitionism and the Triumphal Arch. So all that subject matter, either real terms or metaphorical terms, is somehow associated with the screen that seems to be appropriate to discuss those sorts of ideas. We are, I think, or have had at least 5,000 years of architecture, which is basically classical and is concerned with the vertical on the horizontal. We now have Gehry, we now have Libeskind, and we have Rem Koolhaas, who've blown all that things away now. Our architecture's become somehow, curiously, inverted commas, very organic. So people are trying to get rid of those notions. But we are in the cinema, and I am a painter, and I think paintings relate to the canvases on which you paint them. So we developed an extremely horizontal screen. It is much, much more horizontal and much bigger than a CinemaScope screen, which is 1 to 2.35, and this must be, well, to about 4.6, something like that. There is a way we know the prime horizontal in the world is the sea horizon. You cannot get more horizontal than the sea horizon. But obviously I need to be able to consider the opposite. Isn't it extraordinary that the whole of life on Earth, God-made, man-made, exists probably within 10 kilometers up and down. 3 kilometers below the surface of the Earth and 2 miles higher perhaps than Everest. So everything's contained in that skin. I've actually given a slightly trapezium look to this image because I want to indicate to you you cannot necessarily project on an absolutely flat surface which is at right angles to your vision, and in a way a lot of these screens can be torqued. We can now project on uneven surfaces. And since I have an awful lot to say, I've given myself 3 footnote screens. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 screens. Imagine also with modern technology, you can increase and decrease the transparency of a screen. You can now send an electric current through a plate of glass, and you can not only color it any color you wish, but you can make it virtually 99% opaque, and you could do its opposite. And you could do that on the fly. So when the actual project happens, you can again add this notion, should we say, of visibility and invisibility. Okay, I suggested, let's go beyond the notion, indeed, of local Italian, Olivetti, Ferrari design possibilities, introduce the ideas of the history of art, which I'm sure you all know about, and indeed related, since all human design has to be associated with a human figure, with indeed all the practitioners and all the users of that particular design concept. All right, I'm going to stop talking for a few minutes and show you this film. It's only about 7 minutes long. I have already prepared 3 science fiction features which will be able to relate to the huge, ubiquitous possibility, indeed, of such a consideration of cinema for the future. So could we turn the lights down, please, and let me show you this film. just to remind you that indeed everything in this room, down to your underpants, had to be designed. Everything man-made has to be designed for our use, and that's why we ubiquitously keep introducing the naked human form to relate everything that you are seeing is related to the human body. And of course, you can see, tracking through past history, you can see we start in Pompeii, AD 70, Roman painting, Roman wall painting, and come up to photography. Certainly in that particular case, most of those photographs were borrowed from the archive in Bologna. So again, Italian photography. But it's an indication of something, of course, we know, but it's related also, I think, a lot of the projects that I would, for myself, be associated, I think in general, but particularly in this parallel filmmaking that I have the privilege to be associated with, and I began to discuss with you, it always had to relate to a rather elitist idea of the collapse of cinema. I think cinema collapsing from within because of the notion of these four tyrannies. I've introduced two of them. The tyranny of text in the cinema must surely be overcome. The tyranny of the frame has to be abrogated, so we are not stuck with the notion of the straitjacket of the frame. And then the other two tyrannies for me, the tyranny of the actor. The cinema was not invented to be a playground for Sharon Stone. But we sort of arrange things in association within the screen and without the screen, in magazine culture, television culture, that somehow the cinema, the popular cinema, the mainstream cinema, is very much devoted to the worship of the actor or the actress. Now this, of course, isn't Sharon Stone's fault. It's the way that we have wished and organized to look, indeed, at cinema. And I really do believe that cinema uses actors and actresses very badly. There must surely be actors and actresses in the audience. Put your hands up. No? No? But please don't be shy to admit to anything. No, I think, the basic way we use actors and actors is the same way that Chekhov would have done on the 1890 St. Petersburg stage. And we've hardly progressed from there. There is a way it's all about pretense. Actors and actresses are supposed to speak other people's words and behave in the guise of other people. So that whole notion of Stanislavski and the development of the psychological approach is still very much part of the center of cinematic communication. And I really do think we have to change it. And of course, there are many, many ways that all of us can see how that could be done. But it really needs, I think, a real serious understanding. There's an English phrase which says, we're never going to mend anything until we believe it is broken. So first of all, we have to make a demonstration that the way actors and actresses are used in contemporary cinema is very inadequate, and we must do something about it. And my fourth tyranny, first tyranny, the tyranny of the frame; second tyranny, the tyranny indeed of text; the third, the tyranny of the actor; and the fourth one is very difficult. I'm trying to see where the cameras are, because fourth tyranny, we have to get rid of the camera. The camera is a very, very stupid, unintelligent animal that's all about mimesis. A camera will only reflect what you put in front of it. It has no intelligence. I know cameras have operators, and I'm not accusing you, sir, of being stupid, at least not yet. But there is a way that the actual machine that you're operating is inimical to the development of cinema. I just made a film about Eisenstein, and Eisenstein went to California, and he said the only true cinema maker was, surprise, surprise, Walt Disney. Because in a sense, Walt Disney doesn't use a camera, and he doesn't create mimesis. He doesn't simply reproduce what's in front of us. Of course, he's using Walt Disney not because he was a brilliant businessman, or he was anti-Semitic, or indeed he played with children's stories, but because simply he's a representative of that whole art of cinema, which sometimes is called animation. And Walt Disney, like all animators, basically start with a total empty screen. So their activity is really creative. It's not recreative. If you say recreation very quickly in English, it becomes recreation, which is a different sort of proposition, but one, of course, not entirely outside our argument. So I think we have to find a way to make a reproduction, if you like, which is non-mimetic. You know, the greatest, I'm sure, device in the whole universe is the human imagination. Most cinema, like indeed most painting up till 1861, simply was archival. It reproduces the world as we know it. However you bend and twist, whether you're telling fairy tales or science fiction, it's still basically about realism. And you know and I know that cinema is the most artificial medium we could ever think of. Why does it continue to pursue notions of realism? There is a tradition, I suppose, that English cinema, just think of its practitioners, has always been concerned essentially with the notions of realism. God has already made the world, why do we have to make it again? And we can never make it as good as he could. Let's really use our imagination, the greatest device in the universe, to make something which is essentially non-real. I say, you know, Hollywood, I say, many people say Hollywood, you know, is created what's called a dream machine. That's rather limited, because even when you get Salvador Dali in a Hitchcock film making a dream sequence, it's somehow horribly real again. The possibilities of the medium are so extraordinary. Why do we waste our time making realist cinema? This, of course, brings me back down to, I suppose, a contentious issue. I am supposedly a feature filmmaker, and I've just been awarded yesterday an award for, I suppose, the notion of the documentary. I do not really recognize any difference between the documentary and the feature film. All are lies. There is a way, isn't there? Now you examine the so-called great films of the great documentaries, like Flaherty, like Buñuel, like Vertov. They were lying through their teeth all the time, all the time, all the time. Why do we have to pretend? You know, the very word document has the notion of text in it, which you can understand already is anathema to me. We should be talking about pictures and not about text. But I suspect that all the very sort of influential documentaries that you're aware of are highly subjective, just as Shakespeare was subjective, just as indeed Eisenstein was subjective. So why do we have all these false notions of making a difference between a documentary film and indeed a simple feature film? I have made, I suppose, about 80 films. We're now on our 16th feature film, with lots of other movies and film products that I've now demonstrated to you. And I've made a whole series deliberately, I suppose, rather antagonistically in my early film career, which are called by that terrible word, mockumentaries. Demonstration, indeed, of so-called notions of the language of the feature film and what it does to you, and language considerations of vocabulary and grammar and syntax of the documentary. And to continually jostle them, and to show you, like I tried to demonstrate to you, how conveniently comfort zone the notion of the frame of the story are, and to make a demonstration of all these falsities, and indeed, I suppose, in some senses, the delightful ambiguities and semi-artificiality of cinema. Okay, here's something very serious. I'm reading now in the newspapers, and probably you are, especially American newspapers, we are about to enter a new Cold War era. The Chinese, the Russians, and certainly the Americans, despite Obama's deliberation for the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, are all beginning to rearm, and rearm in a very insidious way, holding down the panic button because people don't want to get too overexcited about this. But I think, you know, for 70 years there has not been certainly a universal war because of the atomic deterrent, because it's so terrifying that when anybody drops a bomb, we know that's the end of the world. But the new plan is to make nuclear arms of a much more limited nature, which can take out a single city, certainly using the situation about radiation. Nobody's going to deny that. Apparently the Chinese are now making underwater drones that can pop out of the water at convenient places and destroy a oceanside city by both contamination, of course, by force. It's absolutely terrifying to think that this, again, after all our concerns about utter destruction through the notion of the atomic bomb, are now seriously being reconsidered, and people are now rearming. I have always thought, because I used to march, bang the bomb, etc. when I was a student, had long hair and a red shirt in the 1960s, marching to atomic sites, complaining, etc., etc. Part, I suppose, the necessity rebellion of the youth, but obviously underpinned with something very serious. I suppose the last 20 years, young people, everybody has been much more concerned with notions of destruction of the planet through ecological misbehavior, notions of overpopulation, etc. And to certain senses, we seem to have maybe moved away from that intense overexcitement, indeed, about the Bay of Pigs and the subsequent relationships between Kennedy and Khrushchev. It somehow shifted. But I've never thought it's gone away, and I've always thought we really, really, really do have to tackle this whole atomic phenomenon. Because obviously the upside is if we can control the atomic energy, we are safe on this planet for another 50 million years. As a source of energy with the collapse of fossil fuels, etc., it is there ubiquitously forever and forever. But of course it comes with this terrifying downside. I made an examination indeed then of how many bombs, in fact, how many atomic bombs had been dropped on the planet Earth. Take a look at this. Can we get the lights? Thank you. Okay, that certainly wasn't a feature film, and it certainly was a documentary. It actually goes to the very heart of the documentary. It documents. As you can see, for every single bomb, over 2,000 of them up till 1991, are documented by time, place, strength, responsibility, etc. And it's obviously a film that works by accumulation. And it's absolutely extraordinary that over 2,000 atomic bombs of a huge ferocity were dropped on this planet up till 91. The efficacy, I suppose, of the notion of the deterrent was that everybody had to know you had a bomb. But after 91, when nuclear non-proliferation began to be part of the human concern in the world, people began very silent. They became very secretive about dropping their atomic bombs. And I'm sure there must be at least another 2,000. So we could say there are probably nearly 5,000 atomic bombs have been dropped on the Earth. And by all accounts, it's about to happen all over again. Okay, the notion then of beginning a lot of my cinematic career with ideas of the documentary. And in the early 1970s, when my great American composer, guru, personal hero, John Cage, came to London for his 70th birthday, and due to an impresario who ran a theatre, we were commissioned to make documentaries about 4 American contemporary composers. And they were indeed John Cage, Philip Glass, Meredith Monk, and Bob Ashley. They're all about an hour long, so I'm certainly not going to show you. But there is a way in which we can introduce a particular sort of language. And indeed, the prologue that was suggested here on this stage was my many years working, in a sense, right in the heart of the documentary tradition, which was associated with people like Grierson and the Canadian Film Board, etc., and is playing a part here. But you must know there are millions and millions of films about music, and surely most of them are curiously unsatisfactory. I can't actually say that these maybe are any more unsatisfactory than thousands of others, but our particular technique was to use the composer's way of composing to compose the film. And you probably know that John Cage was very interested in notions of random choice, the I Ching, and aleatory procedures, and not to relate it indeed to the, at least 1,500 years of classical and musical composition. Let me just show you as an example of that, how very self-reflexive it is in relationship to the actual composing of music. And if I use the word self-reflexivity, I think for anybody who's seen my cinema, I'm very, very keen all the time to have this self-reflexive attitude. When you watch a Greenaway film, I would like you to feel you're only watching a film. It's not a window on the world. It's not a door into the reality of life. It's a deeply artificial construction which vocabulary should only relate to itself. If I were to say to you, and I'm sure you would get the parallel, that Shakespeare's Hamlet is really a play about the theatre, and Rembrandt's Night Watch is really a painting about painting. And I like very much to make cinema, which essentially is about cinema. Let me just show you, in order to explain this vocabulary, a little piece of this film.
This summer I'm going to give a class in mushroom identification at the New School for Social Research. When I proposed it to Dean Clara Meyer, she spoke to Professor McIver, who lives in Piermont. She said, "What do you think about our having a mushroom class at the new school?" He said, "Fine idea. Nothing more than mushroom identification develops the powers of observation." This remark was relayed both to the president and to me. It served to get the class into the catalogue and to verbalize for me my present attitude toward music. It isn't useful, music isn't, unless it develops our powers of audition. But most musicians can't hear a single sound, they listen only to the relationship between 2 or more sounds. Music for them has nothing to do with their powers of audition, but only to do with their powers of observing relationships. In order to do this, they have to ignore all the crying babies, fire engines, telephone bells, coughs that happen to occur during their auditions. Actually, if you run into people who are really interested in hearing sounds, you're apt to find them fascinated by the quiet ones. Did you hear that? They will say. One day when the windows were open, Christian Wolff played one of his pieces at the piano. Sounds of traffic, boat horns, were heard not only during the silences in the music, but being louder, were more easily heard than the piano sounds themselves. Afterward, someone asked Christian Wolff to play the piece again with the windows closed. Christian Wolff said he'd be glad to, but that it wasn't really necessary, since the sounds of the environment were in no sense an interruption of those of the music. During recent years, Daisetsu Taitaro Suzuki has done a great deal of lecturing at Columbia University. First he was in the Department of Religion and then somewhere else. Finally he settled down on the 7th floor of the philosophy building. The room had windows on two sides, a large table in the middle with ashtrays. There were chairs around the table next to the walls. These were always filled with people listening, and there were generally a few people standing near the door. The time was 4 to 7. During this period, most people took now and then a little nap. Suzuki never spoke loudly, and when the weather was good, the windows were open and the airplanes leaving LaGuardia flew directly overhead, drowning out from time to time whatever he had to say. He never repeated what had been said during the passage of the airplane. 3 lectures I remember in particular. While he was giving them, I couldn't for the life of me figure out what he was saying. It was a week or so later, while I was walking in the woods looking for mushrooms, that it all dawned on me.
What we will have when we are ready for it. And that will be what we will have and that. Turn.
Answer the journalist from Illinois who asked me to put all my philosophy into a nutshell. Get out of whatever cage you find yourself in.
The interior of the deconsecrated church of St. James's in Islington, London, was refurbished and redecorated in the year of John Cage's 70th birthday for the performance of a John Cage musical service. A dozen works composed by John Cage over the last 40 years were performed in the space of 2 hours. The way in which they were performed was arranged by a process of chance operations, which determined that several of the works would be played simultaneously, and practically all of them would, at some time, overlap.
Okay, you get the idea. What I found fascinating, since cinema is all about time, back to that notion again of Godard's cinema is the truth, 24 frames a second, we have to be very much aware, indeed, of notions of pace and time, and that relates, I suppose, to certainly an awful lot of filmmaking activity being deeply associated with music. Of course we can make films without music, but I always think cinema without music is somehow impoverished. And I've worked indeed with some extraordinary people, let's call them people who write music or associated with film, and occasionally with some really extraordinary, absolute bona fide composers. I won't show you any more, but you can get an idea. I would also like to say one other thing. This John Cagean notion, he's a great raconteur, and often very, very funny and witty, and he has all these little anecdotes. And he deliberately organized, making us very much aware of time, that every anecdote had to be spoken exactly within 60 seconds. So if he's had a story or an anecdote that was only one sentence long, he had to read it very, very slowly. And if it was 3 paragraphs long, he had to read it very, very fast. An implication again about time and the notion of event and image. But let me move on because I have a lot to show you. One of my, again, heroes in America was Buckminster Fuller, architect, guru, and he was able to keep an audience just like you enthralled for 8 hours. I don't think either you or I are going to spend 8 hours here, but again, you know, a huge amount of material here on a very fascinating subject, cinema, past, present, and future, and what we want from it. So let me move on to another sort of idea. The idea, indeed, of the notion of performance in cinema. You know, again, back to that 24 frames a second, which of course now in television terms is normally 25 frames a second. But there is a way that if you want to associate real time with cinematic time, there are all sorts of problems. But with the tape revolution, the digital revolution, you can come to terms with that. Richard Rogers devised a huge building in the centre of London in association with Lloyd's, the shipping insurers, the people who, of course, once upon a time insured the sinking of the Titanic, if you like, to give you some association. They had a celebration and they asked me to make a performance inside their huge secular skyscraper in the city of London. I chose this title, Writing on Water, because first of all it's deeply ironic and skeptical. You cannot write on water. But I made some suggestions to see, in fact, we could do. What I did is I took, in the English language, there are at least 3 very powerful and important works of literature which are indeed essentially about water. One is Shakespeare's last play, The Tempest. Another is Melville's Moby Dick. And the third one, maybe just a little more obscure, but certainly known by all English students, would be Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. I took important phrases, indeed, from the first chapters of those 3 novels and created a libretto, if you like, which was then given to the London Symphony Orchestra and to the American composer David Lang. And we put together, indeed, a performance. But what is interesting for me here, related to how powerful the digital revolution is this question of organizing time of music, time of filmmaking. Let me show you what we did. Again, it's a 25-minute film, and it's a film of a live event, which already is all sorts of curious artificialities, but will give you an idea. We go back to this notion of different sizes of screens, different performances of screens, if you like, to draw attention that a film is only relevant in a curious way to the screen on which you project it. I'm going to speak over here because I want to draw your attention. Let's keep the house lights down, can we? That there is an element. Can we keep the house lights down? There is an element here, of course, of... can we please keep the house lights down? Thank you. Cinema is always best in the dark. There is a way that there's a live element here. You can see there are musicians here playing deep in music, but we also have a live calligrapher, a man actually rewriting all these words that you see on the screen in a calligraphic hand. And he has a pen and his equipment, and as the music is played and as he responds to it emotionally, he calligraphs those letters all over again to give us another live element. And I am working, and you will see it in a minute, on a touch screen. The Rotterdam electronic digital company made a special machine for me so that I could push and pull all these manufactured images. Images indeed of the conductor, images indeed of the calligraphy, and certainly of the musicians, again to add another element of live association with dead film. Okay, you get the idea. Goes on for 27 minutes, and the music might not necessarily be to your taste. Sorry about that. There is a way also that I feel that our industry, both documentary films and feature films, is very genre-driven. You have the romance, the chase, in a sense, I suppose, relating to the medium, the notion of the cartoon, the music film, etc. Why don't we feel that there's the possibility of combining all these different sort of films related to their manufacture as well as to their content? The BBC commissioned a series of composers in the early 90s to compose a piece of music that was related to some anniversary associated with Mozart, whereas, you know, in the cinema, basically, the pictures come first, and why not? And then afterwards, perhaps somebody thinks about employing a musician or a composer to, in any way, make a sophisticated soundtrack. The BBC was interested in doing it the other way around. First of all, the music, and then the imagery. There is a Dutch composer, a man called Louis Andriessen, now in his 80s. Is considered to be the foremost Dutch composer. And he wanted to work with me, and we put together, indeed, this sort of celebration, memorialization of Mozart to his music. If you know music of Mozart very well, although this is a very contemporary piece of music, you will see all sorts of Mozartian quotations within it. But my excitement was, again, to mixture the notion of architecture, dance, animation, and all sorts of other new techniques that indeed were part of the digital revolution. Take a look at this. Again, it's 25 minutes long. I'll just give you the first 4 or 5 minutes. I have said repeatedly how my unhappiness, my disenchantment about the notions of narrativity and storytelling in the cinema. A little earlier we talked about the likes of people, first of all I suppose Picasso, and then abstract painters like Mondrian and Kandinsky, etc., followed on indeed by all the adventures in painting at the beginning of the 20th century. One of the big revolutions was to take out figuration. The notion of figuration, the depiction of real form, that doesn't necessarily mean characters, but everything else that exists in quote-unquote real terms in the world, which allowed painting to throw off the straitjacket, indeed, of just being essentially illustrated reality, and became its own self. Well, I've repeatedly said how much we have a text-based cinema. Cinema knows this, that's why it always goes back to the bookshop for its material. Cinema, in a curious way, seldom really invents its own intrinsic structural organization. Now, if we're going to transpose those ideas to cinema, I think, just like painting loses figuration, cinema has to lose narrativity. If I were to take any one of you in the audience and ask you to tell me the story of sinking the Titanic, Casablanca, Battleship Potemkin, You'll be able to tell me something, of course, but I bet you'd all dry up after about, 20 seconds? The rest of the story's gone. It's simply not important. What you remember about notions of cinema is not essentially to do with the narrativity. It's to do with a combination of performance, visual stimuli, perhaps color coding, perhaps some accidental phenomena of light and shadow. Just take your favorite films. What some of my favorite films would be with things like Blade Runner, films like David Lynch's Blue Velvet. I could essay very, very briefly what the story was, but most of it's gone because it's not important enough to know and to remember. You know, the idea of using narrativity is just simply the glue in which to hold the substantial bricks of the film together. So if it is so unnecessary, and if it is so unrememberable, why do we spend so much time and effort trying to promote the notion of narrativity in cinema? It is said that the very best painting is always non-narrative. Notions of really good painting does not need narrative. Cinema would need sequence. I would never deny that it does need sequence, but that sequence doesn't necessarily have to be narrative. Now, I know I'm trying to proselytize something here which is very difficult to grasp, or even in a way you don't want to grasp it, because that's in adverse to the way that you understand cinema and the way you want to pursue it. But what I really want to be able to make is an idea, and you can see my enthusiasm for multi-screening. I want to make multi-screen, non-narrative cinema in, and you can see my interest here in live events, in the present tense. Let me say that again. Non-narrative, present tense, multi-screen cinema. I think these are aims and ambitions, and there's indication it's happening all over the place. Perhaps you're aware of it, perhaps you're not. But I believe these have to be characteristics of the future. Technology now is so sophisticated, though unfortunately distribution is very old-fashioned and very archaic. For me to make for you a film on a Monday, to change it on a Tuesday, to change it on a Wednesday, to change it on a Thursday. Film managers, film distributors are going to go berserk. How are they going to manage it? But we have to take cinema out of that equation. Cinema, I keep saying, is dead. There is a way that new technologies, new architecture, new forms, and the ways we look at the moving image are so different from the ways in which our fathers and forefathers that these possibilities are around the corner. And I'm sure we will see it happening over and over again. Now, I say this as a prologue to what I want to show you now. I'm not practicing it so much now, but about 5 years ago, we took a VJ show around the world. I'm sure you all know what a VJ show is. DJ stands for disc jockey, VJ stands for video jockey. So a video jockey does with pictures what a DJ does with music. What happens here is that I made a huge project, probably in the beginning of the 21st century, from about 2001 to about 2007, called the Tull Sleeper Suitcases. I had a grand ambition of making a mammoth product for the information age. It had to satisfy cinema audiences, television audiences, many different languages. It was also a stage play, so it involved live actors. It was also an interactive video game, which we kept going for 3 years. We had 60,000 hits a day for an extraordinary period. It also had to be an opera. I made an opera, and certainly it had to be a library. I wrote 92 books for a library. So there is a way in an age of the multifarious nature of our culture, where all the barriers are broken down, and cinema only becomes part of this huge landscape, to make something which would really satisfy and anticipate the information age with a capital I. Well, it went. It was its prime situation was as 3 feature films, each film 120 minutes long, and these were premiered at the Cannes Film Festival and the Berlin Film Festival, and certainly in Venice. And people were very enthusiastic about them because they saw it as an anticipation of what would happen indeed to notions of a certain sort of future for cinema. But it was an absolute failure in the cinemas in the high speed. It was too soon. It involved all sorts of ways which could never be perpetuated in the cinema. Like, for example, every character, and there were 92 characters, was represented by 92 actors. So can you imagine the complications that ensued and the ability to grapple with what I was trying to do here? There are 92 narratives in this project. It initially calls them Draughtsman suitcases. But there was one way it did, in fact, anticipate all those ways and means that when you sit in front of your television set or your laptop, you can, in a sense, be the filmmaker yourself. That's now possible. So you could interact with it. But of course, it's very difficult to create interactivity amongst a crowd of you, because each one of you is going to want something different. There were experiments, again, in Czechoslovakia in the 1950s, that in a cinema like this, they put buttons on the back of the seat in front of you, so you could interact with the film. The idea was to make a drama, probably a quite conventional drama, a thriller, but to provide it with 5 different endings. And you, the audience, could decide which of those endings to perpetuate. Chaos, of course, almost impossible, because everybody in the audience wanted something different. I think interactivity can only really successfully work with very limited numbers of people, because democratic choice is antithetical to certain notions of interactivity, so that's why I think it is very limited application. But we made a VJ show. Now, VJ shows are interesting. You must remember, all you cineasts, that cinema originally, around about 1900, came out of the fairground. It came out of the circus. It came out of variety theatres. There would be a juggling act, a performance, then a piece of film, and then some other more theatrical activity, and then another piece of film. And gradually it was realized by entrepreneurs that cinema, film, purveyor film, didn't need these extra activities. Though I remember actually seeing Dr. No, remember the very first James Bond film, in a cinema in Amsterdam, probably in the late 1960s, which actually did stop every now and again. Can you imagine breaking up James Bond and throwing in a singer? Live singer came on stage, house lights came on, juggler came on. Very strange way of organizing things. Entertaining, of course, but very irritating and ultimately unsatisfactory. I don't think it ever happens anymore. There used to be, didn't there, in the 1970s, sometimes intervals in films which were filled with other sorts of activity. But I think you don't see that anymore now. But what I thought was always interesting, to see if we can bring back a live element, in order to find ways and means of reinventing cinema. I've tried to do that with several operas, where indeed you would have a combination of cinema and an operatic activity. And of course, I don't know whether many of you go to operas, but the language of the opera house now is often associated with the projection of film in conjunction or in opposition, in some ways, to the singing and to the music. Certainly people like Bob Wilson introduced this sort of idea, and now indeed it's almost impossible, certainly in the opera houses I know in northwestern Europe, to actually ever see a piece of opera without some sort of projection, even if that projection is really related very much to electricians changing the color of everything. So I broke out huge numbers of what I would call separate loops, and utilized them in association with live music, sometimes re-recorded music, in order to reproduce what we indeed call the Draughtsman suitcases VJ shows. Okay, I'm giving you a lot of information here, and it's difficult for you to maybe understand it, but we played this all over the world. We played it in amphitheaters in Greece, we played it in Albert Hall in London, we played it on the beach at Rio de Janeiro, when it was raining and all the audience were given umbrellas to hold up. So there's a way, every time we do it, it's different. I have something like 6,000 loops, which can be played in any sort of order, giving you, the audience, the opportunity to put all this material together and, in a sense, make your own customized film. But what is also interesting is the actual concept of the loop. Sometimes maybe only a few seconds long, sometimes longer, but just to repeat them and repeat them and repeat them and repeat them and repeat them, create their own collections of notions of color coding, of acting, of phrases of music repeated, which in themselves can become very exciting. The notion of loops, of course, in contemporary music, again starting with John Cage, is fairly ubiquitous now, has been part, I suppose, of a modern concert platform for some time. Let me show you then, rather artificially, because I'm going to give you each loop separately, one at a time, but imagine when we do a big VJ show, you could probably see 5 of these loops at the same time, and the concatenation, thinking of Eisenstein montage theory, between what's happening in one loop, inevitably, in your imagination, would affect all the other loops. Let me show you again, because the loops themselves I find very fascinating just in their own right, but when you combine them and put them together in a big VJ show, I think we had 10,000 people in the streets of Sao Paulo. They gave us a big crossing of boulevards. The police came, shut off all the street lights. We even had control of all the lights in all the skyscrapers, so all the office lights went off. I think we had 25,000 in Gdansk in Poland as part of a music festival, but also we've done it in a downtown Brussels discotheque where there might only be 60 or 70 people. So you see it can be fitted to an audience, large, small, outdoors, indoors. I'll show you some of the loops. Could we have a little more volume, please? More volume? Can we have more volume, please?
I've been waiting here for 4 days. I've been waiting here for 5 days. I've been waiting here for 6 days. I've been waiting here for 4 days. I've been waiting here for 5 days. I've been waiting here for 6 days. I've been waiting here for 4 days.
And not a prisoner is a prisoner.
The ideal prisoner and the ideal jailer are interchangeable. Am I the ideal prisoner?
You're a spy and an enemy of Belgium. Then the jailers and not a prisoner is a prisoner.
The ideal prisoner and the ideal jailer are interchangeable. Am I the ideal prisoner?
You're a spy and an enemy of Belgium. Then the jailers and not a prisoner is a prisoner.
The ideal prisoner and the ideal jailer are interchangeable.
That's not surprising. But he was found under a train.
Tells any person innocent charged with murder.
That's not surprising. But he was found under a train.
Tells any person.
We should send him a present to show him our appreciation, our affection. Show him that he'll be well looked after with us.
Just send him me.
We should.
Now, we can talk on more equal terms. This is what we do. Now, we can talk on more equal terms. This is what we do. Now, we can talk on more equal terms. This is what we do.
When a body,
The man who met himself.
is holy,
What sort of chin have you got, Louis? Average? What sort of eyes have you got, Louis? Bloody hell, Marty. The normal sort.
when a body,
The man who met himself.
You mustn't hurt him. This has got to stop. This has all got to stop. This has all got to stop right now. I want the keys to his room. I want the keys to his room.
It's not him, he said.
You mustn't hurt him. This has got to stop. This has all got to stop. This has all got to stop right now. I want the keys to his room. I want the keys to his room.
It's not him, he said.
You mustn't hurt him. This has got to stop. This has all got to stop. This has all got to stop right now. I want the keys to his room. I want the keys to his room.
It's not him, he said.
You mustn't hurt him. This has got to stop. This has all got to stop. This has all got to stop right now. I want the keys to his room. I want the keys to his room.
It's not him, he said.
You mustn't hurt him. This has got to stop. This has all got to stop. This has all got to stop right now. I want the keys to his room. I want the keys to his room.
It's not him, he said.
The night 10 slow night train to Paris will leave platform 9 in 5 minutes. Calling out, Raiffeisen, hold, get, sans Fatomas, Ludovico. The night 10 slow night train.
mouths, hands, genitals, feet, toes. Eyes, noses, mouths, hands, genitals, feet, toes. Eyes, noses, mouths, hands, genitals, feet, toes. Story 1001. Story 1001. Story 1001. Story 1001.
The photographer returned home and took the film from his camera and sent it to a reputable laboratory. The photographer returned home and took the film from his camera and sent it to a reputable laboratory. The photographer returned home and took the film from his camera and sent it to a reputable laboratory.
Tuesday, freeze. Tuesday, freeze. Tuesday, freeze. Tuesday, freeze. Tuesday, freeze.
When not being able to swim, he drowned. 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 When not being able to swim, he drowned.
Okay, you'll probably notice an obsession about the number 92. Number 92 is the atomic number of uranium, and the whole project really was about a history of uranium. Going back again to my perhaps obsessional concern that uranium really is the element, if you like, of the 20th century, and certainly dominates the whole of the history and politics of the 20th century, and certainly now looks as though it's going to be part indeed of the 21st century. You can see here that there's a great vocabulary. Every simple device and complicated device of music, dialogue, color, superimposition, deliberate attempt in some ways to be able to make a demonstration of extraordinary rich the cinematic medium is, but denying, in a sense, the continuities of straightforward narrative and putting a huge amount of onus on you to be able, in a sense, to put the things together. You could regard maybe a loop as like one word, one letter in a word, one word in a sentence, one sentence in a paragraph. And you might know recently Umberto Eco, who died unfortunately very recently, said the beginning is indeed of all sense, and certainly of all literature, was the list. And so there's a notion here of the manipulation of the list gives rise indeed to all the notions of the world's literature. Okay, I think I'm probably going to run out of time, so I will skip this. No, I won't. I'll show you a piece of it. It's very exciting. We were, again, outside of normal cinema of fine arts. We were asked by the city of Lucca, which is near Pisa in northern Italy, to make a projection for the side of a Franciscan cathedral. As you probably know, northern Europe in the 11th, 12th, 13th century was obsessed by the building of towers. It was part of that historical antagonism between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, of which Dante Alighieri became associated. So I wrote a whole series of new stories about, indeed, the antagonisms of the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, and put it together in association with an Italian company of mime artists who found a way, in a sense, to find a visual equivalent for a literary proscript. Again, it's going back to my anxieties about text in the cinema and how, in fact, you can, I suppose, find notions of an equivalence between the power of the image and the power of text. Just take a look at this. There were 14 of those stories. Let me show you the beginning. Let me remind you that these are huge, huge images which are projected on the side of an early Renaissance cathedral. Luca Gistorado said that the ink tower would rise up like a snake to devour the starlings over the Piazza San Martino.
diceva che la torre d'inchiostro sarebbe sorta come un serpente per divorare le storni sopra Piazza San Martino.
della stufa that was too narrow to build a house. So he built a tower instead. The kitchen was in the basement, and the dining room was on the roof, so he had to get used to eating his pasta cold.
Bambi compra un lotto di terra in via della stufa, troppo piccolo per costruirvi una casa. Allora ci costruì una torre. La cucina era al pian terreno e la sala da pranzo sul tetto. Così dovette abituarsi a mangiare la sua pasta fredda.
La Contessa Veracci bricked herself up in her brother's black tower for fear of her love for him.
La contessa Verracchi si murò nella torre nera del fratello, per paura dell'amore che provava per lui.
lots of things to show you, but there's one more idea which I would like to entertain you with. It is very much, as you can see, my fascination with, indeed, painting and cinema. I was several months ago talking to an Italian journalist who said, "How is it, Mr. Greenaway, that you began your career, indeed, as a painter and you're now a filmmaker?" And I said, rather glibly, that I was always disappointed that paintings did not have soundtracks. So maybe that's what I do. I really don't really make cinema at all. I make paintings with soundtracks, but it's an inadequate answer, and you could see I was being a bit facetious. But let me use that as an indication that I have long thought we've had at least 8,000 years of Western painting. If you want to narrow the field, let's talk about the Renaissance. So certainly we've had 500 years of intense activity in the field of painting, with huge numbers of ideas, large numbers of practitioners, but we've only had 120 years of cinema, 1895 to 2015 last year, conveniently 120 years. So, though there have indeed been millions and millions and millions of films, and in a curious way, museums only really began around about the 1850s, so most people, the aristocrats and the church occasionally allowed you to see their collections of extraordinary paintings, but it's only since probably the beginning of the Louvre, for example, was the first major collection of painting, and that's about 1852, I think. So the proliferation of the general accessibility of painting has only been comparatively recent. But I've always thought, with this huge heritage of painting, the beginning of the subject of this lecture, which is about visual literacy, that people should be able to look and to see. I'm trying to think who it was. I think it's probably Picasso said, just because you've got eyes doesn't mean to say you can see. You have to be trained to see. All art, I'm afraid, is not egalitarian. All art is culturally elitist. Training and education is necessary, despite all those grand socialist notions that indeed viewing paintings is for free. It's never for free. It's all related to a huge body of education of all sorts of different complexions. But I've thought that since we wanted to invent a supreme visual vocabulary, visual art form in cinema, that filmmakers ought to be able to see and to look, and to my mind, melancholy sometimes, an awful lot of filmmakers, and one eye closed, and absolutely no awareness at all of the huge heritage of certainly the Western world. I'd have to embrace the Eastern world as well, but I hesitate to make comments about the Eastern world because I'm essentially Eurocentric, like I suspect you are. So in a sense, it's the Western world that we concentrate on in terms of Western ideas of painting. So why can't painters talk to filmmakers? Why can't filmmakers talk to painters? And wouldn't we have a vastly enriched cinema if all these people had, as it were, in their imaginative universe, what people had done before, in order to make it richer and richer and richer. Now, I live in Amsterdam. I live opposite virtually the Rijks Museum, which is just by the Van Gogh Museum. And there was a big celebration in the year 2006, which was the 400th anniversary of the birth of Rembrandt. He's born in 1606. And I was invited to take part in this celebration of Rembrandt. It was intensive, this celebration. There were certainly many, many exhibitions about Rembrandt. There were exhibitions about Rembrandt's mother. There were exhibitions about Rembrandt's dog. And I'm told, though I never saw it, there were even exhibitions about the fleas on the back of Rembrandt's dog. It was really, really obsessional. And I was asked, because people in Holland realized that I was fascinated about chiaroscuro, about the notion of shadow, light, and dark, and whatever you think about Rembrandt, that's certainly his amazing forte. And I said rather ambitiously, all right, I will certainly be entertained by this idea, but you must give me Rembrandt's The Night Watch to project on. Well, long silence there. But we prevailed and prevailed. We had a very, very sympathetic director of the Raiffeisen, and finally we created a program whereby, in a sense, we could unite all the excitements of contemporary cinema with this extraordinary, very valuable painting. The painting itself was uninsurable. Nobody's prepared to insure it. It's just so valuable. It's part of its charter that it should never leave the Rijksmuseum, so it's never been seen in any place, anywhere in the world apart from in Amsterdam. I tell you an anecdote about it. After the Second World War, after the American Marshall Plan was trying to bail out the financial problems of northwestern European countries, certainly including Holland, after the ravages of the Nazis who completely destroyed the economy of Holland. And by 1950, the Dutch weren't even able to return their interest payments on the huge sums of money that had been bailed out by the Americans. So the incumbent American president of that time said, okay, we will forgive you and forget everything you owe us if you give us Rembrandt's The Night Watch. Well, The Night Watch is an incredibly Dutch painting. It's all about a David and Goliath situation. Small little Holland playing, of course, David against the Goliaths of what had happened in terms of European history. And this is a painting of 34 men who are fighting the huge Habsburg Empire based, of course, in Spain, in Madrid, who I think the Civil War went on for about 70 years. Eventually, of course, in 1648, the Dutch won and became independent. But it's a summation of that long, long struggle about the foundations, the notion of the Dutchness, if you like. So there was no way, of course, they were ever going to give up this extraordinary painting. I think it's calculated to be the fourth most famous painting in the world. Number one is Mona Lisa. Number two is supposed to be The Last Supper, both by Leonardo da Vinci, of course. Number three. Can't remember what number three. Let's elevate Night Watch, make it number three. Very, very famous painting. But anyway, we got the opportunity to do that. And what I wanted to do, I didn't want to turn the painting, of course, into a film or an animation, but with very contemporary technology, we found a way to project a painting on itself. Now, this really is, it's not on a facsimile, it's not on a reproduction, it's on the original painting itself, which is worth millions and millions and millions and millions. It was very successful. It went on for, I think, about 4 months. Large audiences came to see what we were doing. And I wanted to make a demonstration of how the painting was painted, what its history was, 2 dimensions versus 3 dimensions, color coding, notions of silhouette, darkness, etc., etc. And it was very successful, but people could see it was a teaching aid, of course. Remember what we said before, all great art should be both instruction and entertainment, and it both satisfied that. And we began to get calls from the rest of the museums of Europe, certainly in Milan, where Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper is hanging on the wall, and has been since, 1498. Leonardo practiced. It's not actually a fresco, it is a watercolor on dry plaster, but Da Vinci played with all sorts of things like turpentine and gun Arabic, and when the painting was finished, everybody was amazed. The most extraordinary painting, and of course, I have to agree. You know, the problem with masterpieces, everybody thinks they know them, and somehow don't pay any attention to them anymore. But I spent probably 6 months every night, because we had to go by night, because you couldn't interrupt the daytime visitors, to see indeed The Last Supper with technicians and my collaborators, very largely film people. And first of all, we photographed an incredible high resolution, centimetre by centimetre, this extraordinary painting by Leonardo, and stitched it together. I think in an average painting there are at least 4 billion colours. You know, when you turn your colour schemes on your laptop, it gives you millions and millions and millions of combinations of colours. There are, I don't know about in French, but there are only about 50 words in the English language for colour. And then we run out of numbers, so you then have to say, you know, a little redder, or a little redder with a bit of green in it, or a little bit of green with a bit of brown in it. So, you know, the ability to deliberated text about color is extremely, should we say, impoverished. And then we put the whole thing together and made a film and projected a film of The Last Supper on itself. Again, in instructions. You know, The Last Supper, of course, is the very, very center of Christian mythology. It's right there, leading up, of course, 3 days before the crucifixion. And it's full of references to St. Peter, and you've all read and know about Dan Brown and all that concern, so all that is in there as well. And it's a demonstration, again, about notions of three-dimensionality, the notion of three, color symbolism, number, cynicism, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Ghost, and extraordinary sense of gravitas. It's really about painting. It's very different to do something in Italy where people still sincerely believe in notions of Christianity. You can't really do that in Holland, where everybody bar none as an atheist. And certainly they would regard Rembrandt as the car mechanic up the road, had a very good wife, looked after the finances, but would never genuflect in front of Rembrandt. But there are many, many people in Italy would certainly genuflect in front, indeed, of Leonardo da Vinci. Still regarded as a pilgrimage painting. Let me make an explanation of that too. If you follow the lines, indeed, of the perspective in that painting, they stretch out side of Santa Maria del Angeli, where it is positioned, deliberately made for that site, so the perspective lines from the refectory are reflected in the painting. But you go out over the whole of Milan, and you travel across Europe, and it is said, The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci predicated the actual position, 300 years later at the Eiffel Tower. And indeed, if you stretch the perspective lines out even further, they actually predict the situation of the Twin Towers in New York. You can believe that if you wish. There's also, on the table of the Last Supper, are plates, knives and forks, pieces of chicken, serviettes, and lemons. And if you put them together in a cosmological diagram, it is a diagram of our solar system and all the nearest stars. I don't know how Leonardo knew that in 1498, but what's even more amazing, the planet, which has now ceased to be a planet, Pluto, is now regarded as an asteroid, but apparently in 1498, Leonardo da Vinci predicated a planet, Pluto, which nobody else knew about until 1931, and it's actually there on the Last Supper table. You see how this is all built into sort of metaphorical language and a desire to push and elevate this painting up to a sort of mystical and supernatural position. Well, we acknowledge that in this little project I'm going to show you in a minute. And there is a sequence that, again, I'm not showing you the image, I hope you have it in your mind's eye. All the apostles are pointing. And if you put all those pointing fingers together, you make a musical manuscript, which is apparently a Jewish song that was in the original Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, which was destroyed by the Romans, which is also the musical score for Beethoven's Fifth. And we set, as it were, these pointing fingers to an Italian composer, and he made a piece of music which structures what I'm going to show you now. agreed to do 9 paintings. In a sense, we have, it sounds so glib, but we have done Rembrandt's The Night Watch, and certainly Da Vinci's Last Supper. There's a painting of the Marriage of Cana by Veronese in Venice, and each time we do it, of course, and there's at least probably 2 years between these because they're big undertakings with lots of technology, and they're expensive, so we have to raise the money. And this particular painting lends itself extraordinarily to notions of cinematic presentation. The Marriage of Cana, of course, as you know, is the first miracle of Christ, where he turns the water into wine. And it's also a Jewish wedding. So I've taken those sorts of ideas, like the impossibility of a miracle, and the notion, indeed, of a Jewish wedding, and given all, I think there are 128 characters in the painting, dialogue. But the state of the art of what we can do of manipulating the images, and please remember, let me remind you again, we're projecting on the original painting, with all that stands for, that technology is increasing and increasing. Let me give you an idea of what the painting looks like, and then I'll show you the finale of the film, where we played some extraordinary tricks, I believe, with incredible state-of-the-art digital revolution magic. Okay, that's the introduction then, so you know the painting, and now here is the provence of the miracle. A cinematic miracle, maybe you can make these things in contemporary cinema, but certainly related, of course, to an important story from the New Testament.
He will surprise you. You were not surprised?
We have no wine.
It could have been anticipated an hour ago.
And even if they had wine, what is it to us? Know that my hour is not yet come. Pour the water now and take it in to the governor of the feast.
He was concerned people might think him a public trickster, a charlatan,
a mountebank. They might now have good reason. I like it. No cloudiness. Completely clean. Almost a smart sparkle. Tight edge. Maybe a little on the sweet side.
Certainly got body. Feels heavier than most. How much left?
The colour is good. I can't believe the kitchens could be that lucky.
Should I drink it? Is it safe?
Where did they find him? This miracle worker.
Is it some trick of the iron throat? How did he do it? Wave a magic hand, put his fingers into the water? How can such a thing be possible? Oh, did he drop in some pomegranate juice, some spirit of figs, duck's blood?
Hold it steady. It may very well be miracle stuff, but it will spill over just like any other wine.
There won't be any left. They are
I can vouch at last for a miracle in a public place.
If such an event were to be repeated every day, we would soon gather a multitude and a decent treasury.
And, no doubt, draw a great deal of unwelcome attention. We would be accused of showing off exhibitionism.
A multitude is too small a number. In the end, we will gather the world.
Okay, thank you.
So we now have 20 minutes for the discussion. We will take, obviously, just a few questions, but please feel free to shoot now.
Bonjour. I'm writing a memory about you, so it's a pleasure to meet you. And I will ask you, do you think that you can recreate the Baroque experience and sensitivity from the 17th century in your film?
Well, I think you as a viewer must surely, I have to leave the judgment to you. I would argue that there's no such thing as history. History does not exist. We could rephrase that and say there's no such thing as history, there's only historians. And we know probably that most historians are liars, Julius Caesar to Winston Churchill. And I think we also would only read the important history which is entertaining enough to keep us amused. So you might find somebody, who's a very, very good historian, but is not a very good writer. So the chances of pervading that particular situation is highly, highly dubious. And I feel, that the question of recreating history, of course, is a highly dubious activity. But it's obviously a very important genre, apparently heretofore, in contemporary cinema. I mean, it's interesting, you must know, I think probably the most successful recent historical movie I would see would be Ridley Scott's Gladiator. It has all sorts of Hollywood associations. But if you're talking about accuracy, it's absolutely inaccurate. Commodius was never killed in the Colosseum. But I think, so somebody said, in the 19th century we learned our history essentially from the novel. And now in the 20th century, most people learn their history from the cinema. So it's a question of Walter Scott to Ridley Scott. Take your pick.
Merci. Est-ce que je peux parler français?
I have translation.
Yeah. Oui, je serai plus précise. Bonjour, merci. Ça va. J'avais plusieurs questions, mais je vais essayer d'être brève. Ce que je ne comprends pas, en fait, c'est pourquoi vous parlez de la mort du cinéma alors que les références que vous avez sont des références de vidéo art et que je les entends parfaitement, j'entends parfaitement ce que vous dites sur la forme du cinéma, le problème des comédiens et le problème de la narration, évidemment, comme l'imitation du cinéma. Mais après tout, pourquoi ne pas laisser le cinéma vivre sa vie, déceptive à votre avis, mais qui de fait la vie est quelquefois pas si mal que ça. Je pense par exemple à Stan Brakhage, qui pour moi est un exemple, si je vous suis, si je suis votre raisonnement, qui est quelqu'un qui s'est en tout cas libéré, peut-être pas du cadre horizontal, mais en tout cas qui s'est complètement libéré de la narration et qui est en mesure de faire des longs métrages que l'on peut voir dans une salle et qui sont passionnants. Voilà, il fait fonctionner la narration à un autre niveau. Donc ce que je voulais vous demander, c'est parce que moi quand j'ai vu, et en particulier la première chose que j'ai vue qui était From Pompeii to Mussolini, j'ai vraiment pensé à Bill Viola et je voulais savoir si ce travail de gens comme Bill Viola ou Pierre Huyghe, je connais peu de noms, j'ai vu les choses dans des expositions, mais je connais peu de gens qui travaillent dans le vidéo art et qui travaillent donc en multi-écran, qui travaillent par exemple Pierre Huyghe qui travaille sur l'image même du comédien, vous voyez. Je me demande comment cela vous intéresse, Comment vous le reliez à votre propre travail?
Well, you can see that there is, even if you don't believe with me that cinema is dying, a reconsideration. We have a brand new technology. The medium is the message. The technology is going to change the way that we create our products. And you are right. I mean, I'm not absolutely alone in this. There are a whole series of people who are itching and pushing. There's a great philosophical examination now of narrativity. What is narrative? Do we need it, etc.? Not only in terms of conventional literature, but all the other applications. So I think I've just seen you a small proportion of a huge amount of activity we're doing, which essentially is experimental. It's pushing a toe into a great ocean of possibilities. It's examining what the new medium can do in terms of time and space and continuity. It's trying to break away from the old verities, which were part and parcel, I suppose, of celluloid cinema. If you take the verities back even further, you know that Renaissance theatre believed in the Platonic verities of time and place and situation. They were all cast aside. We had to find new ways of examining how to tell stories valid in association with all the new media. And cannot you see, this is really part, indeed, I'm not making anything definitive here. I have been privileged to have all sorts of opportunities to explore all the multifaceted possibilities, indeed, of a new sort of cinema. I can't tell you logically what the end product is. I don't know it, and neither do you. But it's very, very important. I would like to think, as a generous prologue to this, it's absolutely essential to keep reinventing. If you don't reinvent, then the whole thing disappears down a drain. And I've shown you various examples of different points of view of an experimental approach to how we can use the new technologies and find out maybe what the cinema, if it ever exists, is going to continue. I would think that, in terms of this desire, human desire for audio-visual excitement, is going to go on. It's not going to go away. And if I can make an evolutionary comparison, each new branch of development is always better than the last. So I'm sure whatever happens next, whether it comes out of social media, whether it comes out of total environmental architectonic notions of cinema, whether it's about reality, whether we can still even use these phrases of documentary and feature film, which I think are totally obsolete, there inevitably will be, I have enormous confidence, that what happens next will be far more exciting than what is happening now.
Thank you very much for this presentation. You expressed yourself on cinema, on painting, on text and sound. What about still image photography? It doesn't even exist?
Well, the eye is very, very lazy. That's why we have cinema. And cinema is composed of still images run together very fast. So surely by talking about cinema, we inevitably are talking about the whole phenomenology of photography and still image.
Okay, next one. Please raise your hand. What do you think of VR, virtual reality, and is that something that you would like to experience?
Well, we have done that. I've made 3D pictures. I've involved, I suppose, in every form of cinematic activity, from Super 8 to Omnimax. I've played with them all, and I think it's very important for a filmmaker who's really entertained and excited by this whole notion of visual literacy that you should explore absolutely everything. I mean, some of the terms that are used in this question, like I don't really recognize this idea of video art. Video art is exactly the same as cinematic art. It's just a different, slightly a notion, again, of people acknowledging, I suppose, a different sort of, in some cases, cheaper, more easily accessible way of still appreciating notions of visual literacy. And what you're recommending is really not that very different from, I think, notions of what are regarded as essentially, let's call it mainstream projection. We're certainly in the age of the screen, but I sincerely believe we're not in the age of cinema anymore. cinema is not central to our lives. It's not the necessary wellspring of all sorts of things that we've been talking about. I mean, the very way we look at cinema now, it's certainly not very often on a big screen like this in the company of many people. And I think that makes a big, big difference. I don't think we should. I mean, you could see I enjoy big screen cinema that's noisier and bigger than you are, you know, that has all those characteristics we accept of all the other great, shall we say, 18th and 19th century art forms. But before Nokia went broke, you remember that Finnish film Nokia? They gave me a lot of money to make a feature film on this. And then people said, well, Mr. Greenaway, you're used to, you know, grandiloquence and the Baroque and so on. How could you organize that? But if you think about it, if I made a film on such a machine like this, I could reach my friends in Shanghai and Beijing with probably about 10 seconds. And it would probably be very cheap. And there would be an idea, the ideas that I would want to purvey could very instantaneously get to audiences. Artists need audiences. That's absolutely not, I think, negotiable. We need audiences, whether it's one people, I don't know, a pack of dogs or 30,000 million. That's essential. So if I can communicate to the people I would like to communicate to in Beijing and Shanghai, then I'm prepared to use this. I have to throw an awful lot away, of course, but there are advantages in immediacy in the expression of ideas. You know, I can't play about very much with color grading. The way that people would see my feature films here might be whilst, you know, waiting for a train or reading a newspaper or even sitting on the lavatory. So there's a different way the purveyance of the art form is going to be relative. But let's go back again to that such very useful phrase, the medium is the message. You have to maximize what this instrument is extremely good at doing and be prepared to jettison the other things. But as you can see, you know, I've been given extraordinary privileges here, both within conventional cinema and outside it, to be able to experiment with different forms of technology, ideas, shapes, notions, arguments, etc., etc.
Hi there. You spoke about the primacy of the visual versus the written word, and yet I noticed that you used quite a lot of time the written word in your work, and also with reference to the point which you made about how film is in a certain sense still images with a soundtrack, and you spoke about sound. The advent of sound caused a kind of a loss in cinema, and could you not consider also the spoken word as a form of soundtrack, so the written word and...
But I do, all the time I do. I'm surprised you asked me the question. Have you seen the latest film we've made called Aisastani Guanajuato? And a very, very dense, multi-layered soundtrack full of all sorts of literary tropes which you're certainly familiar with. But there's another thing too, that, you know, text is an image when written, and so I want to indicate to you the very notion of text as image as well as text as text. And often I would give you the text but never give you the time to read it, or convolute it, or destroy it, or disparage it in ways to make a demonstration indeed of the very arguments that I want to discuss with you. Okay, time for lunch, I think. Thank you for your attention.